A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey, the ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels, galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet.
Journey of the Magi was first published in 1927, the same year Eliot converted to Anglo-Catholicism. The poem was first published for a series of booklets and greeting cards that were issued in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Eliot said, "I have no illusions about it. I wrote it in 3/4 of an hour after church time and before lunch one Sunday morning with the assistance of half a bottle of Booth's gin." Thematically, it's a poem that explores notions not unfamiliar to Eliot's previous poems. A search for meaning in a somewhat nihilistic modern society. In this case, the hardships associated with the journey toward any kind of spiritual rebirth. The notion of alienation as a result of a cultural shift, and an overwhelming obsession with time. However, potentially as a reaction to his recent conversion, Journey of the Magi suggests elements of hopefulness, even if they are shrouded in doubt. Stylistically, it employs tropes that are also familiar to Eliot's previous poems, his blatant anachronism that rejects conventional linearity, his use of illusion, in this case for the purpose of demythologizing past texts, and his fragmentation of the poetic form, designed to challenge the reader to think for themselves. Let us consider the influence of Eliot's personal context, as it may help to illuminate a broader perspective on the notion of a spiritual journey. Eliot said, "Most critics appear to think that my Catholicism is merely an escape or an evasion. It's rather trying to be supposed to have settled oneself in an easy chair when one has just begun a long journey afoot." When discussing the Magus, he said, "What is significant to me is not simply the conclusions at which he has arrived, but the fact that he arrived there from somewhere else. And not simply that he came from somewhere else, but that he took a particular route. The stages of the journey, analogous with my own journey." The opening 5 lines of the stanza are adapted from a 1622 Christmas sermon by Lancelot Andrewes, a bishop who helped establish the Anglican Church. The sermon was on the text of Matthew chapter 2 verses 1-2, which describes the coming of wise men from the east. Although Eliot maintains the style and the tone of the sermon, he transforms the narrative voice from third person to first person. Notice the cumulative phrasing and the informal syntax which develops a stream of consciousness and a more realistic flow of memory. What's most interesting is what this does to the concept of time. How can the Magus living in the time of Christ's incarnation draw on a sermon delivered 1600 years later? The rest of the first stanza is dedicated to a representation of the hardships associated with the journey. Through the use of juxtaposition and sensory imagery, he symbolises the discomfort and possible regret associated with a journey from one set of beliefs to another. In this case, he's most likely depicting a journey towards a life of spiritual enlightenment. Notice the anaphora, the alliteration and falling cadence Eliot's employing in order to maintain the rhythm and tone of a recitation. The last 2 lines of the first stanza are particularly interesting, with the voices singing in our ears saying that this was all folly. Let us consider for a moment the evolution of an account of this journey. According to Matthew in the New Testament, a great multitude of the heavenly angels appeared from heaven, beckoning them to embark on the journey. And so they proceeded eagerly. "Let us go to Bethlehem and see this thing that's happened, which the Lord has made known to us." 1600 years later, in a sermon by Andrewes, the Magi still hurry cheerfully to worship him with all the possible speed they could, sorry for nothing so much as that they couldn't get there soon enough. However, by the time we get to Eliot, he portrays the Magi as disgruntled and doubtful of what lies ahead, with the voices singing in their ears saying that this was all folly. Eliot's blatant rejection of the traditional nativity story and historical plausibility that the Magi were Christians already creates a sense of fragmentation for the reader. The Magi's regret and increasing doubt at the absurdity of the journey implies a sense of alienation and might possibly be closer to a fictionalised account of Eliot's personal search for faith. At the beginning of the second stanza, Eliot employs pathetic fallacy again to signify an abrupt temporal shift from winter to spring. According to Daniel A. Harris, this abrupt transition embodies the topos by which medieval and Renaissance painters indicated the radical alteration in human history that Christ's coming signals. The Magi have made their way from the harsh desert to a temperate valley, full of symbols representative of Christ's future life on earth. Just to name a few, we can see the baptismal waters of the River Jordan, a symbol of spiritual awakening and rebirth. The symbol of the watermill beating the darkness, which speaks of rejuvenation, conquering the darkness of sin and sacramentally of baptism. The three trees, representative of the three crosses on the hill of Golgotha, a symbol of death and sacrifice. The white horse found in Revelations, a symbol of war and conquest, potentially symbolic of the death of paganism under the onslaught of Christianity. Or as Nancy Hargrove suggests, the horses being old perhaps represents the old dispensation that will fade away with Christ's birth. This theme of discarding and replacing ties into the synecdoche then of 6 hands that holds connotations of Judas, who sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, as well as the soldiers who diced for Christ's garments during the crucifixion. Again, as you'll notice, Eliot is distorting the notion of time, not only by presenting us with images proleptic of Christ's future even before he's born, but by distorting the traditional linearity and biblical timing of those events. As Harris notes, he's juggled their chronology, giving them a random sequence and altered their usual appearance. Why do you think he does this? Is this method of defamiliarization designed to disorient us, the reader? Is it to symbolise how alienated the Magus is from the world around him? Is it to comment on the power of God to transcend linearity and historical orientation? And why do you think he puts you, the reader, in opposition to the Magi by allowing you to read signs that the Magi are oblivious to? Is it to comment on the power of symbols to subvert religious exploration? Is Eliot teasing us and our intellectual pride for equating literary knowledge with religious faith? Is the point maybe that a search for meaning is an inward rather than an outward journey?
All this was a long time ago. I remember, and I would do it again, but set down this, where we led all that way for birth or death.
The third stanza employs a drastic temporal shift and switches from fragmented anachronisms and ficto-historical allusion to profound metaphysical questioning. At this point, it's interesting to ponder the question of who in fact is recording this conversation between the Magus and the scribe. Surely the scribe themselves didn't record the lines, "set down this." And those lines themselves that imply fragmented informal speech are fascinating. Is it an allusion to the dying words of Shakespeare's Othello, "set you down this"? Othello, after all, had experienced, like Eliot, the journey of a spiritual conversion to a new religion. Is it another reference to the sermon of Lancelot Andrewes, who writes, "Secondly, set down this"? It's even been suggested that by demythologizing Matthew's Gospel, Eliot may even be questioning the authenticity of canonical texts, reinforcing his feelings of alienation, even from his newfound religious community. In 1935, in a work titled The Christian in a Modern World, Eliot wrote, "Even in what are called Christian countries, we find the minds of people about us growing more and more alien, so that on vital matters we often find that we have no common assumptions." Now, long after the journey itself, Magus ponders the meaning of all that happened. He begins his contemplation by emphasising that the experience was so valuable that he would do it again, in spite of the hardships of the journey. This again possibly echoes the hardships and rewards of Eliot's personal spiritual journey. Eliot employs enjambment to emphasise an informal voice designed to build tension towards a moment of contemplation. Notice how his style of writing has become analytical and paradoxical, as reflection turns from the sensory world inward. Were we led all that way for birth or death?
We return to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation. with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death.
The antithesis symbolises the alienation of one group of people by the coming of another. In this case, the birth of Christianity, ultimately signalling the death of a range of other religions at the time, chiefly the Zoroastrianism of the Magi themselves. Not too dissimilar to Eliot's hollow men from 2 years earlier, the Magi are alienated from the rest of the world, caught in a limbo, somewhere between BC and AD, a period of transition between their old Zoroastrian faith and the new emerging faith of Christianity. The Magi return from their encounter with the Incarnation to a now alien people, clutching their gods. And the poem ends with the Magi suggesting that with all this confusion and indecision, he would be glad if his own death came to settle the matter. Now, for all its negativity, the poem is rich in Christian symbolism, and for the first time, there's at least the sense that the journey of life is not absolutely pointless, but rather a challenging experience. Thank you for watching. I hope some of that has been helpful, and I would encourage you to use this video as a tool, as a launching pad to your own exploration of the poem.